The old Hale store at the top of Sixmile Gap had been dead 20 years. Everybody in Bristow agreed on it, yet every few winters a driver crossing the gap in the dark came down swearing the chimney had been smoking. Amos Hale was 8 years in the ground. The place stood shut and boarded, sway-backed under a rusted tin roof, $100 on the county's abandoned rolls, and never once bid. Dead stores do not keep a fire. But someone had kept one lit in that store all those years, holding it ready for the one who had not yet come up the mountain to find it. Her name was Tess Coulter, 20 years old, with $35 in her coat pocket, a quarter tank of gas, and a 1999 Chevy Cavalier with 197,000 miles and a heater that blew only cold. Beside her sat her brother Sam, 11, who had not said a word in 3 years. Their mother had been dead 11 days. Their stepfather, Del Rooker, wanted the government check that came each month with Sam's name on it. $1,367. A grown girl of 20 stood between him and it. He put them out in a freezing November rain with 2 garbage bags of clothes. He told Tess to her face he was not running a boarding house, and shut the door while she stood in it. One place was left. 14 miles up the mountain, where 2 roads crossed at 3,900 feet, stood the store her grandfather had run and closed, the dead building all of Bristow had written off. In her mother's sewing tin, she had found a notched brass key and 4 words in her mother's hand. For when it's needed, what lay behind the heavy oak door that key fit was none of the rot she braced for. Amos Hale had spent the last 20 years of his life keeping it ready for the one of his blood who would someday climb this mountain. And, under the floor, locked in the rock behind a second door, he had left a thing 30 families down the gap had lived safely on top of for half a century, none of them knowing his name was on it. But before the open door and the name cut into the counter, there was a girl climbing a mountain she had never driven, 11 days after she buried her mother, with a silent boy beside her and nowhere to take him. The sleet started an hour before dark, on the second Tuesday of November. It came down out of a low sky the color of wet ash, and it froze on the windshield faster than the wipers could push it away. Tess drove with her whole body leaned forward, the way you drive when you cannot afford to be wrong about the road. And beside her Sam sat with his hood up and his hands buried in his sleeves and said nothing, which was the only thing Sam ever said. He had not spoken in 3 years, not since the morning the men from the county came to the door about their father. The doctors in Bristow had a name for it and a folder for it and had charged their mother for both, and none of it had ever once made the boy say a word. He watched everything, he missed nothing. He simply kept it all behind his teeth. Tess had learned to read him the way their mother had learned to read weather. Off the small things, the set of his shoulders, the place his eyes went. Right now his eyes were on the heater vent that blew nothing but cold, and she reached over without a word and zipped his coat the last 2 inches to his chins. She was 20 years old, and she had never driven this road in her life. She only knew it existed because of the way her mother's face had changed. Once, years ago, when a woman at the grocery in Bristow had mentioned the old store up at Sixmile Gap. Her mother had gone quiet the way still water goes quiet, and had not spoken the rest of the afternoon, and had never explained. Tess had been maybe 14. She had filed it away, with all the other rooms her mother had kept locked. And she had not thought of it again until 11 days ago, going through the little apartment they had all shared, when she had opened the tin of buttons and thread on the top closet shelf and found the key at the bottom, wrapped in a scrap of flannel, heavier than a key had any right to be. For when it's needed. Her mother's handwriting, small and slanted and sure, it was needed now. The rain had started while Del was still in his chair. Tess had come in from her shift at the laundry in Bristow, 4 hours folding other people's sheets for money that went straight into the coffee can. Del kept on top of the refrigerator, and she had known the second she stepped through the door that something in the house had already been decided. He had the mail open on the arm of the chair. The envelope from the county with the little cellophane window. The first survivor payment to come since her mother died $1,367, made out to Del Rooker as the person the government trusted to spend it on an 11-year-old boy. He had looked at her over the top of it and told her, plainly, the way a man reads off a grocery list, that he was not running a boarding house, that she was grown and could see to herself, that the boy would stay because the boy came with the check, but that she could go tonight and take nothing that Del had paid for, which by his accounting was everything in the house, down to the coat on her back. Then Sam had stood up from the floor where he was doing his homework and walked to the door and put on his shoes. He had not looked at Del. He had not looked at anyone. He had simply decided, in the wordless final way Sam decided things, that wherever his sister was going, he was going too, and there was no argument on earth that was going to move him off it. Del had seen it, and his face had gone hard, because the boy was the check, and the check was the point, and for one bad moment Tess had thought he would put his hand on the boy to keep him. He had not. Whatever else Del Rooker was, he was careful about what a neighbor might see through a window. He had opened the door instead and thrown 2 garbage bags of their clothes out onto the wet boards of the porch, and he had told Tess that if she took the boy, she took the trouble with him, and that when the money stopped coming, he would make sure the king knew whose fault it was. She had carried the bags to the car in the sleet. She had buckled Sam in. She had 11 days of grief in her, and $35 in her pocket and a quarter tank of gas, and she had sat in the driveway with the engine running, and her hands shaking on the wheel, and she had understood with a terrible clarity that she had nowhere in the entire world to take her brother out of the cold. And then she had thought of the key. The Cavalier climbed, past the last streetlight in Bristow, past the shuttered feed store and the boarded church, past the turnoff for the old mine road, where the woods came up close and black on both sides. The pavement narrowed and then gave up being pavement at all, and became a graveled county lane that switched back on itself up the side of the mountain. The sleet turned to a fine hard snow the higher she went. The heater blew cold. Sam breathed on the inside of his window and drew a small circle in the fog with one finger and rubbed it clear so he could watch the trees go by. And Tess kept both hands on the wheel and took the switchbacks at 15 miles an hour and prayed to nothing in particular that the tires would hold. Sixmile Gap sat at 3,900 feet, where 2 mountain roads crossed at the top of the world. There was nothing else up there. No houses she could see, no lights, just the 4 arms of the crossroads reaching off into the dark, and on the far corner, hunched against the weather like an old animal that had lain down to die, the store. Her headlights found it and held it. It was bigger than she had pictured in Satyr. A long, low 2-story building of gray board and batten under a rusted tin roof, with a covered porch running the whole front and a pair of gas pumps out by the road so old they belonged in a photograph. A faded sign hung crooked over the porch, the letters barely there under 20 years of weather, and she had to let the car roll close and put the brights on it before she could read what it said. Hales, and under that smaller, General Merchandise, Sixmile Gap. Hale, her mother's name before she was a Coulter, before she was ever a Rooker, Diane Hale. Tess had seen it on exactly one document in her life, her mother's own worn birth certificate, folded in the same box as the sewing tin. She had never once heard her mother say it out loud. She sat with the engine running and looked at her grandfather's name on the dead store in the snow, and something moved in her chest that she did not have a word for, part fear and part a grief that was older than her own, as if the building had been waiting in the dark not for a customer but for her, specifically for a very long time. Beside her, Sam had gone still. He was looking at the sign, too. Then he turned and looked at his sister, and in the green light off the dashboard she saw him do the thing he did, instead of asking a question, tip his head a half inch and hold her eyes, and she understood him as clearly as if he had spoken. "I don't know," she told him honestly. "Your grandfather's, I think. Mama's daddy. I never met him." Sam looked back at the store. The snow was coming harder. The gas gauge sat under a quarter and dropping, and the nearest town that would have a room, if she'd had money for a room, was 14 miles back down a road. She was not sure she could climb a second time if she left it. There was no choice in it, really. There had not been a choice since Dell shut the door. She turned off the engine, and the silence of the mountain came down over the car like a hand. "Stay here a minute," she said. "Let me see if the key even fits." She left the headlights on so she could see, and she stepped out into the cold. The wind at the gap took her breath the moment she cleared the car. It came straight across the crossroads with nothing to break it, and it drove the snow sideways and found every gap in her coat. And by the time she had crossed the 20 feet of frozen mud to the porch steps, her hands had gone stupid with cold. She climbed the 3 steps. The porch boards were solid under her feet, not soft, not rotted, which was the first thing that was wrong, though she was too cold to notice it as wrong just yet. The door was oak, wide and heavy, with a tall glass panel gone gray and a brass lock plate below the knob. She fit the notched end of the key into it. She had to work it, because her fingers would not do fine things anymore. And for one sick moment, she was sure it would not turn. That she had climbed a mountain in a storm on the strength of 4 words in a dead woman's tin, and would now have to climb back down. Then the key found its seat, and the works of the lock turned over with a heavy, oiled, well-kept thunk, and the door came open under her hand. Warm air came out to meet her. She stood in the doorway and could not make sense of it. It was not the damp, dead, mushroom smell of a building shut up for 20 years. It was warm. It smelled of wood smoke and cured wood, and something faintly sweet underneath. Dried apples, maybe, or old honey, and it rolled out over the threshold and touched her frozen face like a room in a house where people lived. She stood there with the snow blowing in past her and the cold at her back, and this impossible warmth on her face. And for a moment her tired mind simply refused it. The way you refuse good news you don't yet dare to believe. Then she stepped inside, and she saw the light. It was small and low and orange, banked coals behind the mica window of a big iron stove that stood in the center of the store, and it threw just enough glow to shape the room out of the dark. She could see the long counter running down the right-hand side. She could see shelves, floor to ceiling, on every wall. She could see the black shapes of barrels and crates, the hanging scales, the flue of the stove going up through the ceiling. Everything was in its place. Everything was dusted with a fine gray film of time, but nothing was ruined. Nothing had fallen, nothing had been let go. Someone kept this room. The thought arrived quietly, and it frightened her more than the cold had. She stood very still and listened, and heard nothing but the wind on the tin roof and the small tick of the stove, and after a moment she made herself breathe. There was firewood stacked in a box beside the stove, split fine dry as paper. There was a box of long matches on the warming shelf. Whoever kept the fire was not here now. But they had been here, and not long ago, because coals did not hold 20 years, or 20 days, or even 2. Coals like that were a day old at the most. She went back out into the wind, and the cold felt personal now, like something she was being asked to leave her brother in and would not. She opened his door. "Come on," she said. "It's warm. I don't understand it, but it's warm. And you're not sitting out here." Sam looked at her for a moment to be sure she meant it. Then he unbuckled and slid down out of the car, and she took his hand, which he allowed because it was cold, and not because he was a child, and she brought him up the steps and in through the oak door and pushed it shut behind them against the storm. Inside, with the door closed, the warmth was a live thing. Sam stopped 3 steps in and simply stood, the way an animal stops when it comes in from bad weather, and Tess watched some of the tension go out of his small shoulders, and it undid something in her to see it. She had gotten him somewhere warm. Whatever else happened, whatever this place was, she had done that one thing. She found the matches and lit one, and by its light she found a kerosene lamp on the end of the counter, its chimney clean, its bowl half full. She had grown up with a grandmother who used them in ice storms, so her hands knew the trick of it. And she got the wick to catch and settled the chimney and turned it up. And warm yellow lights spread out and filled the store. And her grandfather's whole life stood up out of the dark around her. The shelves were stocked. Not the wreck of a store, not the tumbled cans and gnawed sacks she had braced herself for, but stocked, orderly, deep. There were glass jars by the hundred, rowed up on the shelves behind the counter, and when she lifted the lamp to them, she saw green beans and shelled corn and pickled beets and quartered apples and whole tomatoes and dark jars of what could only be sorghums and honey. There were tin canisters labeled in a careful hand: cornmeal, flour, pinto beans, coffee, salt. There were bolts of wool cloth and stacked wool blankets sealed in cedar chests along the back wall, and oil for the lamps in a stone jug, and a whole low shelf of candles, and coils of rope, and boxes of matches, and lengths of stovepipe, and everything a family cut off on the top of a mountain in the worst of winter could possibly need to not die. It was not a store that had been abandoned. It was a store that had been provisioned, stocked deliberately, and kept for something. Tess walked the length of it slowly with the lamp held up, and Sam walked at her shoulder, and neither of them spoke, because it did not feel like a room you spoke in. The dust lay soft on the tops of things and thin on the fronts, as if someone came through now and then and touched what they walked past. On a peg by the stove hung a man's canvas coat, old and clean. On the counter sat a ledger book, closed, and a pair of reading glasses folded on top of it, as though the man who used them had set them down for a minute and would be right back. She reached the far end of the counter, and she raised the lamp, and she saw the carving. It was cut into the front edge of the counter's hardwood, deep and plain, the letters worn smooth at the edges by decades of shirt cuffs and shopping arms leaning against them. A name. And she knew before she read it whose it would be, and reading it was still like a hand laid flat against her breastbone. Amos Hale, and under the name, smaller, a line of words cut with the same knife. No soul turned back into the cold. Tess stood and looked at it for a long time. Behind her, the stove ticked, and the wind hunted along the eaves, and her brother came and stood beside her and read the words too, moving his lips the way he did when he read, silent, missing nothing. "Amos Hale," she said quietly, to the store, to the boy, to herself. That's who you were, her grandfather, her mother's father, a man her mother had carried in her like a locked room to the day she died, and never once opened, not to her own daughter, not even at the end. And here he was, cut into his own counter in his own hand, with a promise under his name that Tess did not yet understand, but that had, she was beginning to see, just been kept for her. She set the lamp down on the counter beside the folded glasses. Her legs had begun to shake, from the cold going out of her, from the day, from 11 days, from 3 years, from all of it at once. She put both hands flat on the worn wood, and she bent her head, and for the first time since the men had come to the door about their father. Longer than that. For the first time since she had understood as a girl that she was the one who was going to have to hold the two of them together, because no one else was going to do it. Tess Coulter let herself cry. Sam did not say anything. Sam never said anything. But he moved close against her side, and he put one thin arm around her back, and he held on, and he let his sister be the one who needed holding for a change. And the two of them stood like that, in the lamplight in their grandfather's store, while the storm shut the mountain down around them. After a while the crying wore itself out the way weather does. Tess wiped her face on her sleeve and drew a long breath and looked around the warm room with clearer eyes, and she began at last to think. Someone kept this fire. Someone kept these shelves. That someone was not her, and was not her mother, who had never in Tess's life climbed this mountain, and was not her grandfather, whose name was cut into the counter with a promise that had the weight of a last thing. Which meant that somewhere out in the storm, within a day's walk of this stove, there was a living person who came up to a dead man's store and banked its fire and turned its lamps, and would, sooner or later, come up that road and find two Coulter children standing in the middle of it. She did not know yet whether that would be the best thing that had happened to them in 11 days, or the worst. But she meant to be warm and fed and ready when it came, either way. She had learned that much from Dell. You do not let the cold, or the man, catch you sitting still. She built up the fire. She fed it 3 splits of the fine dry oak from the box, and worked the damper until the coals took and the flame came up. and heat began to roll off the iron in waves. She found the cedar chests along the back wall and lifted the lid of the nearest one, and the smell of cedar came up, and inside were wool blankets, folded in squares, heavy and clean, a little stiff with age but sound. She carried an armload to the space near the stove. She pulled 2 crates over for a windbreak and made a kind of nest of the blankets on the plank floor where the heat was best, and she sat Sam down in the middle of it and wrapped him to the chin. Then she went looking for something to eat, because she had not eaten since a bowl of oatmeal at 6 that morning, and neither had he. She was careful about it. Whatever else this place was, it was not hers, and she had been raised by a woman who did not take what was not offered. But there was a hand-lettered card tacked to the shelf above the food, and she held the lamp to it and read it, and the careful old writing settled something in her. "Whoever you are," it read, "if you are cold, the wood is yours. If you are hungry, the food is yours. Eat and be warm, and stay until you are able. You owe no one here anything. A hail." Tess read it twice. Then she took down a jar of green beans and a jar of quartered apples and a canister of cornmeal. And she found a cast-iron skillet hanging clean on the wall behind the stove, and a stone crock of lard and a pitcher. And she went to the back and found the hand pump at the little sink, and worked it until it drew. And cold sweet water came up out of the mountain into her hand. Spring-fed, she understood. It ran downhill into the store, whether the world had money in it or not. She had cooked on a wood stove at her grandmother's until she was 10. Her hands remembered. She made cornmeal mush in the skillet and warmed the beans in their own liquor in a small pot on the stove lid. And she cut the apples into a bowl. And she and Sam ate sitting in the blankets with the plates on their knees. And it was the best food Tess had ever eaten in her life. Not because of what it was, but because of where they were not, which was out in the storm, which was on Del Rooker's porch, which was nowhere. Sam ate everything on his plate. That, too, undid her a little. He had been eating like a bird for 11 days. Tonight he ate like a boy. Afterward, she washed the plates in pump water and set them to dry and banked the stove down the way her grandmother had taught her. And she turned the lamp low, and she lay down in the blankets with her brother between her and the stove, one arm over him, and she listened to the storm and to his slow breathing as he went under into the first real sleep either of them had gotten since their mother died. She did not mean to sleep herself. She meant to keep watch for whoever kept the fire. She was 20 years old, and she had driven a mountain in a storm and buried a mother inside of 2 weeks, and the warmth took her down like a tide, and she slept. She woke to gray light and the smell of coffee. She came up out of the blankets fast, with her heart going, and there was a man in the store. He was old, 70 at least, tall and spare, and gone a little stooped, in a green wool coat worn pale at the cuffs and a knit cap, and he was standing at the stove with the coffee pot in his hand and his back half to her, in no hurry at all, the way a man stands in a room he has stood in 10,000 times. He had let himself in without a sound. He had built the fire up. He had put coffee on. And when he heard her move, he did not startle. He simply turned his head and looked at her with a pair of pale, steady eyes under white brows, and took her in, the girl and the sleeping boy and the nest of blankets, and something in his weathered face moved, and then went still and careful. "Didn't mean to wake you," he said. His voice was low and rough and unsurprised. "Coffee'll be a minute." Tess got herself between the man and her brother without quite deciding to. "Who are you?" she said. "Boyd Whitaker." He set the pot back on the stove. "I keep the store." He said it simply, the way another man might say he kept bees. "Question is more who you are, young lady, though I believe I can guess. You've got the Hale look, around the eyes." He nodded toward the counter, toward the carved name she could not see from where she stood but that they both knew was there. "You'd be Diane's." The sound of her mother's name in this stranger's mouth, up here, went through her like cold water. "You knew my mother. I knew of her." Something passed over his face. "Amos talked about her. Toward the end, mostly. You favor her." He studied Tess a moment longer, and then his eyes went past her to Sam, who had woken and sat up in the blankets and was watching Boyd Whitaker with that flat, complete, unblinking attention of his, taking his measure. And that'll be her boy, my brother, Sam. Tess kept her voice even. Our mother passed 11 days ago. We didn't have anywhere. I found a key in her things, and the name of this place, and I didn't know what else to do. She lifted her chin. If we've done something we shouldn't have, we'll go. But I'm not taking him back out in that until it lets up. Boyd Whitaker looked at her for a long moment, and then he did a thing that surprised her. He took off his knit cap, the way men of his years took off their hats for weddings and funerals and news, and he held it in his 2 hands, and he said, "No, ma'am, you haven't done a thing wrong. You've done exactly the thing this store was built for. You've come here with nowhere to go, and you've let yourself in, and you've kept warm." His voice roughened. Amos Hale spent the last 20 years of his life making sure that when one of his own finally climbed this mountain with nothing, there'd be a fire lit and food on the shelf and a door that opened to his key. He kept it ready himself as long as his legs would carry him up here, and I've kept it for him the 8 years since he passed. Near on 20 years that door's been sitting ready. I'd started to think nobody would ever come. He looked at Sam and back at Tess, and the pale eyes were wet, and he did not bother to hide it. And here you are. Tess stood very still in her grandfather's store, while the truth of it came down over her slowly. Like the warmth had the night before, too big to take in all at once. You kept it, she said. The fire, the food, 20 years. Somebody had to. Boyd Whitaker put his cap back on. He paid it forward, you might say. There's a little fund at the bank in Bristow he set up before he passed. Pays me a small wage to come up twice a week. Keep the stove banked. Put up food in the fall. Keep the roof sound. Keep the rats out and the damp out, and the road passable. Rotate the jars so nothing spoils, the old ones to my own table, new ones up. It's not much money. I'd have done it for nothing. He looked around the warm, stocked room with the plain love of a man for a long work. It was the last thing he asked of me. He said, "Boyd, keep it ready." He said, "They'll come cold, and they'll come with nothing, and they won't believe it's real. And when they do, you tell them the truth of it, so they'll stay." So, he drew a breath. That's me telling you the truth of it. This is yours. It has been yours since before you were born. And there's a good deal more of it than what you can see standing here, if you're of a mind to know. Tess looked at him. More. Under your feet, Boyd Whitaker said. But that's not mine to open. That part he left for Blood. He nodded at the counter, at the long worn run of hardwood with her grandfather's name cut into the face of it. Behind the counter, he'd want you to find it the way he left it. I'll pour the coffee, and I'll sit here with the boy, and you go on and look. Take the lamp. Tess did not move for a moment. Then she stepped past him. Around the end of the counter, into the narrow, worn track, behind it where a shopkeeper stands his whole life. And she raised the lamp, and she looked down at the floor. The counter ran the length of the room, and behind it the plank floor was worn pale in a path by decades of one man's boots. But at the far end, under where a heavy oak flour barrel stood against the shelving, the planks ran a different way. A square of them, cut and relaid, and fitted close, a door in the floor. She had to move the flour barrel first, and it was full, and it would not slide. So she rocked it off the trapdoor a few inches at a time until the square was clear. Then she saw the iron. A heavy hasp was set into the planks, and through it a bolt, and the bolt was fitted with a lock, and the lock was old and black and the size of her fist. She knelt over it and turned the brass key in her hand and saw that the other end of it, the end she had not used, was cut with a different set of notches. She fit it to the lock. It did not want to go, 20 years of stiffness in it, and she had to lean her weight on it and work it back and forth. But at last the bolt drew back with a hard clack that she felt in her arm. The hatch itself was swollen shut in its frame and would not lift. She got her fingers in the seam and could not raise it. In the end, Boyd Whitaker, without a word, brought her a flat pry bar from a nail behind the door, and she worked it into the seam and put her weight down on it, and the hatch let go all at once with a crack of old wood and came up on its iron hinges. And a breath of cold stone air came out of the dark below. It was not the damp of a wet cellar. It was the clean, even, mineral cold of stone that never changes, colder than the store, colder than the storm, but dry, the deep, steady cold of a spring house or a cave. Amos Hale had cut himself a room in the actual rock of the mountain. Stone stairs went down into it, worn but sound, and Tess took the lamp and went down them one at a time with her heart in her throat. And Boyd stayed above with the boy the way he'd said he would. The cellar was small and square, and lined with dressed stone, and it was dry as a bone, and it was cold enough that she could see her breath by the lamp. Shelves of the same stone ran along two walls. On them, in the lamplight, she saw shapes of it, the whole rest of her grandfather's life, that had waited under the floor of his store for someone of his blood to come down and claim. There were wooden crates of jarred goods, the deep stores, the ones meant to outlast even Boyd. There was a rack of tools, oiled, wrapped in waxed cloth. There was a long, flat wooden box that she would learn held the store's original account books, 40 years of them. And in the center of the floor, on a low stone plinth cut for the purpose, sat a strong box of gray iron with a brass plate on the lid. And on top of the strong box, weighted down against nothing, kept dry in the changeless cold for the better part of 20 years, was a bundle of letters tied in butcher's twine, and a single sealed envelope laid across the top of the bundle, with one word written on the front in a strong old hand. Not a name, not her name. He had not known when he wrote it which of his blood would come, or when, or even if. The one word on the envelope was, child. Tess sat down on the cold stone floor of her grandfather's cellar with the lamp beside her and the envelope in her two hands. And for a long moment she could not open it, because once she opened it, she would know him, and she had spent her whole life not knowing him, and there was a kind of safety in that she was about to lose. Then she thought of Sam upstairs in the blankets, and of Dell's face over the top of the check, and of everything that had brought her to the floor of this room, and she broke the seal. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but the ink was black and clear in the cold, dry air. She held the lamp close, and she read. Child, it began. If you are reading this, then you came here with nowhere else to go, and you found the door open, and that is the whole of what I wanted. So before I tell you anything else, let me tell you that you are already home. You do not have to earn this. You do not have to be good enough for it. You came cold and you are warm now, and that is the end of the debt. Everything past this is only me explaining myself, because a man likes to be understood, even too late. Tess read it with her hand pressed over her mouth. My name is Amos Hale, the letter went on, and I was born in this county in 1929, and when I was 11 years old my own people put me out. It does not matter now why. It was a hard winter, and there was not enough, and I was the one they could spare, and I spent the coldest night of my life on the porch of a store much like this one, at a crossroads much like this one, hoping the man inside would open the door. He did not. I have never in my long life forgotten standing on those boards in the dark, 11 years old, listening to a warm room on the other side of a locked door, and understanding that I was on the wrong side of it, and that this was simply how the world was arranged. I was wrong about that. It is not how the world has to be arranged. It is only how it is arranged when the people who could open the door decide not to. I decided a long time ago that if I ever had a door, it would be open. Tess lowered the letter. Her hands were shaking. Above her, faint, she could hear the small ordinary sounds of Boyd Whitaker moving about the store, the clink of a cup, and once low, the old man's voice saying something to Sam, and impossibly, nothing back, because Sam did not answer. Sam never answered, and yet the man kept talking to him kindly all the same. The way you talk to someone you have decided is worth talking to whether they answer or not. She looked back down at the letter, and she read the next part, and it was the part that changed everything, and it began. Now, let me tell you about your mother, and why she is not here reading this instead of you. If you have made it this far into Tess Coulter's story, this is the place to stop for 1 second and hit the subscribe button, because everything up to now has only been the cold and the climb and the open door. And what her grandfather wrote next, about the daughter he lost, and the valley he saved, and the trust with her family's name on it, is the part I have been waiting the whole story to tell you. Subscribe, and stay in the warm with them, because the man Del Rooker is not done. and neither is Amos Hale. Your mother, the letter went on, was the best thing I ever did and the worst thing I ever handled. Diane was 15 the year her own mother died, and this store was all I had left to give the two of us to hold on to. And I held on to it too hard. And I held on to her too hard. And when she was 19 and fell in love with a boy from down in Bristow that I did not think was good enough for a Hale, I did the one thing I had sworn on my own life I would never do to another living soul. I put her out. I stood in the door of this store, this very door, and I told my own daughter she could go, and I watched her go down that mountain in the back of a boy's truck, and I did not open the door again. Tess read it through a blur. She knew that boy. That boy had been her father. That fight, that leaving, that closed door at the top of the mountain, was the reason she had grown up without a grandfather, the reason her mother went quiet as still water when a stranger said the name of a store, the reason there had been a locked room inside Diane Coulter, her whole life, that she carried down the mountain and never once opened. Not even to her own daughter, not even at the end. I was too proud to go get her, the letter said, and then too ashamed, and then it was years, and then it was too many years, and a man tells himself the next spring. I wrote her 41 letters. She never answered one, and I do not blame her, because a girl remembers the door closing longer than she remembers everything good that came before it. That is the whole tragedy of it, child. She learned the lesson I taught her that day at the door, and not one of the 10,000 better things I meant. When I could not reach her with my hand, I set out to reach whoever came after her with everything else I had. I could not open the door for my own girl in time. So I built a door that could be locked again, and I have kept it open for her children, and her children's children, down all the years I would not be here to see. If that is you, reading this in the cold, I am sorry I was not the man to open it for you myself. But the door is open, I made sure of it. Go up and put another log on the fire. There was more to the letter. But Tess had to set it down for a while and press the heels of her hands to her eyes, because it was too much all at once. The grandfather she had never met and the mother she had just buried. Both of them explained to her in the space of one page, both of them wrong in the same proud way and paying for it across 40 years. She thought of her mother folding that little brass key into a scrap of flannel and writing for when it's needed, and putting it in the bottom of the sewing tin. Diane had never climbed the mountain. She had never answered the letters. But she had kept the key. She had never thrown it away, and she had never used it, and she had left it where her daughter would find it when the daughter had nowhere else on earth to go. It was the closest her mother could come. Tess understood to opening the door herself. She had left it unlocked for her children with her own last silence, the way her father had left it unlocked for her. When she could see again, she looked at the strongbox. The brass plate on the lid was engraved, "For the one who comes." She tried the second end of the brass key in its lock, and it fit, and the lid came up on a smell of oil and cold iron. It was heavy with silver. Rolls of silver dollars stood on end in rows, wrapped in paper gone soft with age, and under them, loose, more coins, hundreds of them, dull gray in the lamplight, each one heavy as a stone in her palm. She did not count them then. Later, with Boyd, they would, and there would be a little over 2,000 of them, old cartwheel dollars a man had set aside a few at a time across a working life. Worth, Boyd guessed, far more as silver than as dollars. But it was not the coins that made her sit back on the cold stone. It was what lay flat in the bottom of the box beneath them, in a waxed envelope kept dry 20 years in the changeless cold. A deed. And a trust. She carried them upstairs into the light, because her hands were shaking too hard to read fine print by a lamp in a cellar. And she spread them on the counter under the window. And Boyd Whitaker came and stood at her shoulder and put on the folded reading glasses that had waited on the ledger, because they had been Amos's. And now it seemed they were hers, and between the two of them they read it out. The first was a deed. A long time ago, the paper said, in 1971, Amos Hale had bought the mineral rights to the whole of the valley that ran down the north side of Sixmile Gap, every acre of it, the coal and the stone, and the gas under 30 families' farms, and the creek that watered all of them. Tess did not understand what she was looking at until Boyd told her, quietly, standing there in his worn green coat. There was a company, he said, come up here in the 70s, wanting to take the top off this mountain for the coal. Would have filled the creek with the spoil, poisoned the water for everybody down the gap, run the lot of us off in the end, the way they did 3 counties over. They were buying the mineral rights out from under folks for pennies, off people that didn't know what they were signing. And Amos, he didn't have but this store and what he'd saved out of it. But he went around this whole valley, farm to farm, and he bought the rights himself, at more than the company was offering, families he'd carried on credit for years. And then he sat on them, never mind an ounce, never let anybody else, just held the whole valley in his own name so no company ever could. Boyd looked at her over the top of the old glasses. That water's still clean because of your grandfather. Those farms are still farms. There's men and women all down this gap this morning who don't know the half of why their creek runs clear. He never told them. He didn't do it to be told. The second paper was the trust. Amos Hale had gone down to Bristow to a lawyer named Harlan Pruett, and he had put the store, and the land it stood on, and the mineral rights to the whole valley, and the fund that paid Boyd, and everything he had into a trust. An irrevocable trust, the paper said, in words Tess had to read 3 times, which meant that Amos could not have taken it back himself once he made it, and no one else ever could either. It could not be sold. It could not be borrowed against. It could not be reached by any debt or any court, or any man who married into the family, or any grandchild's cruel stepfather who thought a signature might get him at it. It named the beneficiaries plainly, the descendants of Diane Hale by blood in order forever, and it named, in a hand added later at the bottom, in fresher ink than the rest, 2 names that stopped Tess's breath, Tess Coulter and Samuel Coulter. He knew about us, she said. Her voice would not stay level. He knew our names. He kept up, Boyd said gently, as best a man can from the top of a mountain that his daughter won't answer. He knew Diane had married the Coulter boy. He knew there was a girl and then a boy. He had Harlan Pruett add the names the year before he passed. He wanted it certain. He wanted no lawyer down in Bristow ever to be able to stand up and say, we don't know who Amos Hale meant. He meant you, Tess, both of you. By name. The old man's jaw worked. He died the next spring, 8 years back. I sat with him at the end, right up there in Bristow at the county hospital, and the last thing on his mind, the very last, was whether Diane's children would ever find the key. I told him they would. I don't know that I believed it, but I told him so he could go easy. He took the glasses off, and they did. Tess sat down on the stool behind the counter. Her grandfather's stool, worn to the shape of a man she would never meet, and she held the trust that had her name on it, and her silent brother's name on it, written by a dying man 8 years before either of them had a single place in the world to stand, and she understood, finally and completely, what she had climbed the mountain into. It was not a store. It was not silver, though there was silver, and it was not a valley, though there was a valley, clean water for 30 farms held safe in a dead man's name. It was a door her grandfather had spent his whole life learning, the hardest possible way, that the only thing a man is finally worth is whether he opens the door or keeps it shut. And he had gotten it wrong the one time it mattered most, with his own daughter, on these very boards, and he had spent the 40 years afterward building a door out of iron and stone and law that could never, ever be shut again on a child of his who came in from the cold. Diane had not been able to walk back through it. But Diane had kept the key and pointed her children up the mountain with her last silence, and here they were, warm in the middle of it, exactly as the old man had promised, the boards he stood on that no soul would ever again be turned back into the cold. Sam had come over while she read. He stood at her knee, looking at the paper with his name on it, at the 2 words Samuel Coulter in a stranger's careful hand, and Tess watched him read it, watched his lips move over his own name, and watched something come into his still face that she had not seen in 3 years, since before the men came to the door, since before the boy went quiet, not a word. but a color, a light, the look of a child learning, for the first time in a long time, that somewhere in the world, before he was even born, someone had written his name down on purpose and meant to keep him warm. "He knew you," Tess told her brother. "Your grandpa. He put your name here so nobody could ever leave you out again. You hear me?"
Your name's on it? This is yours?
Sam looked at the paper a long time. Then he looked up at his sister, and he lifted one thin hand and laid it flat on the worn wood of the counter, on the carved letters of the old man's name, the way you lay a hand on someone to let them know you are there. Boyd Whitaker turned away and busied himself at the stove so the children would not see his face. Outside, the storm had blown itself down to a hard, bright cold, and the sun had come up white over the ridges, and the snow lay a foot deep and unbroken across the crossroads of Sixmile Gap. It should have been the end of it. A girl and a boy, warm, fed, safe, named in iron and stone, home at last at the top of the world. It would have been the end of it, if Del Rooker had been the kind of man to let $1,367 a month drive down a mountain and out of his life without coming after it. He was not that kind of man. And 2 days later, when the county road crews had scraped the switchbacks down to gravel again, a green sheriff's department Bronco came grinding up the last grade to the Gap with Del Rooker in the passenger's seat. Tess saw it from the window. She knew the shape of him before she could see his face, the way you know a bad weather front on the horizon, and her stomach dropped, and her first thought was Sam. And she went and stood between her brother and the door the way she had done the first morning with Boyd. Only this time, there was no mistaking what was coming. Boyd Whitaker looked out the window over her shoulder and read the whole thing in a glance, the county truck, the man in it, the girl's white face. "That'd be the stepfather," he said. It was not a question. "He's Sam's payee," Tess said. Her voice had gone thin, for the check. "He'll say I took Sam. He'll say I stole him." She heard how it sounded even as she said it, a 20-year-old with no address and no money, and a minor brother in a building that wasn't legally, as far as any sheriff knew, anything to do with her. "He'll make it look like I'm the one did wrong." Boyd looked at her for a moment. Then he did 3 things without any hurry at all. He put another log in the stove. He took his old coat down off the peg and put it on. And he went to the counter, and he cranked the handle of a black telephone she had not even noticed sitting there. An old wall set wired to a line Amos had kept paid the same way he'd kept everything else, and he said into it, "Nell, Boyd, ring the Gap for me, would you? Tell them Amos Hale's grandchildren are up at the store, and there's a man come with the sheriff to take the boy back down. Tell them I'd count it a kindness if they'd come stand on the porch." He hung up. He looked at Tess. "You just stand still and tell the truth," he said. "That's the only thing your grandfather ever asked of anybody. The rest of it's already been done. He did it 8 years ago at a lawyer's desk in Bristow, and it's stronger than that man and his sheriff both. You'll see." The Bronco pulled up at the foot of the porch steps, and Del Rooker got out before it had fully stopped. He came up the steps hard, and he had his righteous face on, the one he wore when he had decided in advance that he was the wronged party. And behind him came the sheriff, a heavy-set, tired-looking man of 50 in a brown coat named, Tess would learn, Elmore Sizemore, who plainly did not want to be up a mountain in a foot of snow settling a family matter, and had come only because the law made him. Del did not knock. He came through the oak door with the cold rolling in behind him and pointed one finger across the warm store at Tess. "There," he said to the sheriff. "That's her. She took him out of my house 11 days after his mother died. I'm his payee. I'm the one the government named to look after him, and she loaded him in a car in the middle of the night and run off up here. I want him back down the mountain today, and I want it on the record what she did." He was breathing hard. His eyes went around the store, at the stocked shelves, at the warmth, at the strongbox that still sat open on the counter with the silver in it, and Tess watched the calculation move across his face. Watched him understand for the first time that this was not an empty ruin, that there was something up here worth a great deal more than a monthly check, and watched his greed and his outrage fold together into one thing. "And I want to know," he said slowly. Just what all she's got her hands into up here that she didn't tell anybody about. Sheriff Sizemore took his hat off, which was more than Dell had done, and looked at Tess, and looked at the boy half behind her, and sighed the sigh of a man who has broken up 100 of these. "Miss," he said, not unkindly, "is this your brother? Did you take him from Mr. Rooker's residence?" "He's my brother," Tess said. "Sam, and I didn't take him. Mr. Rooker put us both out in the storm on the second Tuesday of the month, at night in the sleet. He set our things on the porch and shut the door. Sam put his own shoes on and came with me because he wanted to. I didn't have anywhere to take him but here." She lifted her chin. "This was our grandfather's store. Our mother's father. Amos Hale. It's ours now. Sam's name is on the paper same as mine." "That's a lie," Dell said. "There's no paper. That old man's been dead for years. She's making it up. She's got no more claim on this place than the man in the moon. And she's got no claim on that boy at all. I'm his payee." He turned to the sheriff. "You going to stand there? Take the boy." And that was when the first truck came up the grade. Tess heard it before she understood it. The low grind of a farm truck in low gear on the last switchback. And then it came into the crossroads and stopped. And a man and a woman got out of it in their barn coats and came and stood at the bottom of the porch. Steps in the snow and looked up at the door, saying nothing, just standing there. Then there was another truck behind it. And then a third, and an old Jeep, and a woman on foot who had walked up from the nearest farm with a shawl over her head. And within a quarter of an hour, there were better than 30 people of 6 Mile Gap standing in the snow at the foot of the porch of the dead Hale store. Farmers and their wives and grown sons, and an old man on 2 canes. Whole families whose creeks still ran clear and whose land was still their land, and who did not, most of them, even fully know why. And they stood there in the cold and looked at the sheriff and at the stranger from Bristow, and they did not say a word. They did not have to. There is a kind of standing that says everything. Dell Rooker looked out at them through the open door, and some of the color went out of his righteous face. An old sedan came last, slower than the rest, and out of it climbed a small, precise old man in a good wool coat with a leather folder under his arm. And Boyd Whitaker said, "There's Harlan Pruitt," in a voice with quiet satisfaction all through it. Amos's lawyer. Nell must have rung him in Bristow, too. Harlan Pruitt came up the steps, at the pace of a man in his 80s, who has never once in his life let being hurried make him careless. And he came into the warm store, and he looked at Tess with the boy behind her, and his old eyes went bright, and he said, "You'd be Diane's girl. I've had a folder with your name in it, in my office for 8 years, young lady, waiting on you." Then he turned to the sheriff, and he opened his leather folder on the counter beside the open strongbox, and he laid the law down as flat and plain as a man laying down cards. Dell Rooker, he explained, was the representative payee on the boy's federal survivor benefit. That was all he was. A payee was a person the government trusted to receive a child's money and spend it on the child. It was not guardianship. It was not custody. Dell Rooker had never adopted Samuel Coulter, had no legal relationship to the boy at all beyond a mailing address the government sent a check to, and a payee who put the very child he was paid to house out into a November storm had, in point of fact, abandoned the trust the government gave him, which Mr. Pruitt would be documenting in a letter to the Bristow field office that same afternoon. As for the girl, Tess Coulter was 20 years old, and the boy's only living blood family, and she was, moreover, along with her brother, the named beneficiary of an irrevocable trust, drawn and filed and sealed 8 years prior, that owned the ground they were all standing on. There was no question of anyone taking anyone off this mountain. The only open question, Mr. Pruitt said, folding his hands on his folder, was whether the county would prefer to see a 20-year-old granted guardianship of her own brother the ordinary way through the family court, which he would be filing for on Monday, and which every soul standing in that snow would come to Bristow and testify for, or whether the county would rather explain to a judge why it had helped a man reclaim a child's monthly check by force after locking the child out in the cold. The store was very quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, 30 people stood in the snow and waited. Sheriff Sizemore put his hat back on. He looked at Del Rooker for a long moment, and whatever he saw there made his mouth go flat. "Mr. Rooker," he said, "I believe we're done up here. You'll want to be in touch with that field office about the check, because it sounds to me like you're about to not be the payee anymore. And you'll want to get in the truck, because I'm not leaving you up this mountain, and I'm surely not leaving these children down at your place." He turned to Tess, and the tiredness had gone out of him, and he touched the brim of his hat to her the way Boyd had taken off his cap the first morning. "Miss Coulter, I'm sorry for your mother. You did right by your brother." He nodded at the room, at the warmth at the shelves. "Looks like somebody did right by you." Del Rooker went down the porch steps between the silent people of Sixmile Gap, and not one of them touched him, and not one of them said a word, and that was worse for him than anything they could have done. And Tess understood, watching him go small across the white crossroads, that this was what her grandfather had meant, that the dignity was the whole of the victory, and the revenge would have only cheapened it. The Bronco backed around and went down the mountain and out of their lives, and the people of the Gap stood a while longer, and then they came up onto the porch, not to take anything, only to see an old woman with her shawl who had known Amos, a farmer who remembered being carried on credit through a bad winter when he was a boy, and they looked at Diane's children with their grandfather's store, alive and warm around them, and they were glad in the plain way of mountain people, and they said so, and then they went home to their clean creek and their own land, most of them still not knowing the whole of why it was theirs. When they had all gone, and the light was going gold and long across the snow, and Boyd Whitaker had gone out to see to the road and left the two of them alone by the stove, Tess sat down in the blankets beside her brother. "We're staying," she told him. "This is ours. Nobody can put us out of it. Not ever," Grandpa made sure. She looked at the fire. "We'll open it back up, I think. In the spring. The store. Keep the fire lit. Keep the shelves full. Keep the door open, the way he wanted. So if anybody ever comes up here cold the way we did, there's a warm room and nobody asking them to earn it." She was talking to herself as much as to him, making it real by saying it. "I think I'd like that. I think Mama would have liked that." For a long time, Sam did not do anything at all. He looked at the fire, and he looked at the carved name on the counter that he could see from where he sat, Amos Hale, and the line under it, and his lips moved as he read it, silent, the way he read everything. And then, in a voice rusty and small and unused, a voice Tess had not heard in 3 years, a voice she had begun in the worst believe she would never hear again, her brother said, "No soul turned back into the cold." Tess did not move. She was afraid that if she moved she would break it. She sat perfectly still with the firelight on her face, and tears standing in her eyes, and she said, very quietly, "That's right, Sam. That's exactly right." "Can we really stay?" the boy said. "We can really stay." Sam nodded, once the way he decided things, and he leaned his head against his sister's shoulder and looked into the fire. And outside the window the last of the sun went off the snow at the top of the world, and the store their grandfather built, to keep his promise, stood warm and lit against the coming dark. Amos Hale had been 11 years old on the wrong side of a locked door once on the coldest night of his life. And he had spent the rest of that life making sure that no child of his blood would ever stand where he had stood. He never got to open the door for his own daughter, and that was the sorrow he carried to his grave. But a legacy is not the money in the box, or the deed in the drawer, or even the valley held clean in a dead man's name. A legacy is a door left unlocked for people you will never live to meet. He left one open at the top of a mountain, and 20 years later, on the coldest night of her life, his granddaughter turned the key. And no soul was ever turned back into the cold at 6 Mile Gap again.